one panel coming up. Really excited about that. This audience has a ton of questions, so I'm going to make sure that we can dive into those with the panel. Before we do that, though, wanted to go back into the product analytics playbook. There are a lot of questions around the concept of critical event. How do you define that? So if everyone could go to page 14 within their book, and in there you can actually see examples of other companies' critical events and how you can actually use product analytics to determine what your critical event is for your company. So this is a great exercise to go through to actually have a hypothesis and then use the data to figure out what that is, and then now start to actually use that to drive the OKRs, the metrics that you have within your company. Cool. So what I'd love to do is invite both Chris and Oliver up to the stage, and then we will kick off the panel. Make sure everyone got your notepad out. Going to be a lot of great knowledge to kick off. So what I'd love to do first, quickly introduce Chris Moses. He's the Director of Product Management at Athena Health. And Oliver Young is the Principal Product Manager at LastPass. I'd love to just start by hearing a bit from each of you on kind of what experiences led you to the company you're at right now and what gets you really excited about your current role. And we can start with you, Chris.
Sure. So I had a small machine learning company called Arsenal Health. We predicted patient no-shows for doctors' offices. So if you booked an appointment and you're gonna miss your appointment, or you had missed a lot in the past, we'd predict you more likely to miss than someone else, and we'd suggest trying to get you to come in or actually double booking you, similar to how airlines do that. So we sold the company to Athena about a year and a half ago. Athena is in an interesting place where they're on a journey to use more and more data and to really reorient themselves around becoming a product company. Someone had a really interesting point about B2B companies. Healthcare is a little bit unique in that people were mandated to buy electronic health records, and we would be selling, and the industry would be selling to the CFOs, the people signing checks, but they're not actually the end users of the products. And we're finding now that the mandate's over, everybody has EHRs, retention is becoming super important. So I think the thing that excites me is that we're making that transition, and we're trying to not leave the end users behind and thinking a lot more deeply about how to solve for that customer experience.
That's great.
So I am currently at LastPass. We are a consumer password management tool. If you don't use ours, I hope you use one of them. I've been a product manager for about 10 years. I started out in B2B software, spent a little bit of time in ad tech, worked my way over to the consumer side. So what brought me ultimately to LastPass is two main things. One, I was looking for a consumer product, which is what gets me really excited about working on the product. There's a few million people who use our product every single day, which is very exciting to come in and know that there's a few million people who, if we screw up and ship a bad experiment or shut something down, they can't get into Amazon or Facebook or whatever it happens to be. And I like the fact that it's a space that really matters to people. Keeping people safe and really making their web experiences better is something that I find really exciting.
That's great. Yeah, and I think that really speaks to the power that product can have in changing people's lives. I think for both of them, I think critical things. So what I'd love to do, we talked a lot today about speed, right? And becoming a product company means to move fast. I'd love to hear examples from each of you of where you felt like you've done a good job of actually moving quickly, and then maybe some areas where you feel like there's still some work to be done within your organization.
Yeah, so I think Athena's got some interesting cases where I think we do a really good job of, so we have Scrum designers. We have about 100 or so, depending on how you count it, Scrum teams that are actually developing user-facing features, and a design team with about 60 Scrum designers that are embedded across these teams. And they do a pretty good job of creating screens in Sketch and throwing it in front of users, doing paper prototyping, resonance testing. It's a really good, fast, cheap way to get that feedback. Colleague also just shared an experience he had where he did click testing. So they created a new design and found that the first place the users were clicking on the screen was going to lead to far lower task completion success for the new design, so they actually trashed it and didn't end up building anything, any code behind it. So I think we do those things pretty well. we're also transitioning to Agile. So I think before we were doing waterfall, and it's good for planning and designing, but it's bad because you don't get your products in front of people for a while. So we transitioned all of our teams to Agile over the past year or so. So we're still on this journey to build product faster and actually experiment a lot faster.
Yeah, I'd say for LastPass, we're still on that journey towards speed as well. Prior to LastPass, I was at Twitter for 3.5 years, where we were very fast, all things considered. A lot of experiments. If you were a product manager with an engineering team with a good idea, you could generally get it built in a few weeks. And did we lose my mic? Oh, there it is. You could generally get it built within a few weeks and get an experiment out to 1% of the Twitter user base shortly thereafter. And with 350 or so million monthly active users, that was a fun group to play with. At LastPass, the way the product had been built initially, it was a small team that was acquired by LogMeIn a couple years ago. They really built based on kind of that vocal minority of users who kind of yelled at them and said, hey, why doesn't this work? And a lot of it was just, let's do what they ask. So it was a lot of intuition. It was a lot of talking to individual users who maybe were off to one extreme end of a usage scenario. And what we've been trying to do since I joined a little over a year ago is bring an experimentation framework to the product, to bring solid analytics where we can get towards that situation where we say, look, we think that this particular piece of the product is not working quite right. We can see that our retention rates are lower. We can see that people are using this feature and not that feature. Can we come up with something quick and easy? Can we move this button from one side to the other, or whatever the experiment happens to be, and run it? And it's something that we're doing a much better job of. We're running active experiments, both on our actual user base as well as on our own employees, which is also fun. It's a nice place to start, see if the employees like it or revolt, and then go from there. And it's something where I think we're making good strides. We often get bogged down in, because we serve both individuals and businesses. Can we roll this out to businesses at the end of the day? Will they have a different reaction? So there's certainly some growing pains there. Adam, one of my former colleagues, is here in the audience. He was reminding me that one of the features that he and I shipped almost a year ago for consumers is still just barely rolling out to businesses, even though it had a huge bump in our retention rate for individuals. We saw much better results. So sometimes it's very slow and frustrating, but in general, I think we're pointed in the right direction and picking up speed along the way.
That's great. Yeah, and one thing that I loved you bringing up is the concept of the vocal minority. I think that's something that a lot of companies kind of over listen to. It's really easy to, because they're right in front of your face. We've talked about the concept where a designer talks to 5 people. But if you're constantly building just for that vocal minority, you're going to find a local maxima. So it's really important to think about. Sarah Tavel actually talks about this. She used to run product at Pinterest. You got to think about the next 10x or 100x of your users and start building for them and doing experiments to engage them versus just building for your current power users. I think it's a great concept. So a lot of people today have asked about the concept of critical events, as well as how do you make sure, not only do you determine what they are, but how do you make sure that everyone kind of has visibility into that? One of the things that I'd love to hear more about from you, Oliver, you talked about kind of defining critical events, but also kind of the visibility of it. I actually shared with Varun, who's the customer success manager for LastPass, how you actually have everyone has visibility into that. Would love to hear more about the process of creating the critical event and then how you get visibility into that as well.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in the OKR framework, starting with the metrics that are important to you and your business, and then basically building roadmaps and goals and so on out of that. I think it's far and away the best way to run a product and run a product team. For us, the kind of single North Star metric, the most critical event is daily active users, where we define active as you are saving a password or you are signing into a website. So those are the two biggest things that people do in our product. So for us, we're trying to drive that number up. It's a great rallying cry for the whole company. It's great to take our marketers and say, how are you contributing this? Take our sales folks and say, how are you contributing to this, and so on. But frankly, at the end of the day, for us as a product team, it's probably a reductive metric. It's a bit distracting. It's something where that number will fluctuate for reasons that are completely outside of our control. So because we're a security product, when Yahoo loses 3 billion users, passwords, or whatever the number happens to be, we see huge ramp-ups in our adoption, huge ramp-ups in the number of people who are saving passwords, who are filling them in, and so on. It has nothing to do with us and how we actually measure ourselves as a product team. So what we end up with is a whole array of, thank you, we'll switch over. And what we end up with is a whole array of metrics that we use to really try to be nuanced about these types of things. And very often they're tied to individual experiments. So if we're running a particular project, if we shipped a particular thing, we'll have obviously those big key metrics that we're trying to move, but a whole bunch of smaller metrics along the way. What we like to do is have big screens, not unlike the ones you see on the side, up in the offices with actually Amplitude dashboards that just rotate through. There's some nice plugins to Chrome where you can just rotate through tabs every 30 seconds or so and refresh the page along the way. So we get those live metrics sitting there in our office. So as you're walking to your desk or as an executive walks by, they can look at a number that is spiking up and say, wasn't that great? Or a number that's spiking down and say, what the F just happened? And then usually somebody scrambles off to figure out if we mucked up the data capture or if something actually is going on or if we have an outage or something. But that visibility into those metrics, both in terms of what's important to us as a business as well as how we're moving them on a day-to-day basis, even an hour-to-hour basis in some cases around launches, is really important and really is a great rallying cry for us.
That's great. That's excellent. Yeah, I love the forcing function of knowing that at any point in time somebody could ask you about a metric. Like, you're going to understand your data. You're going to understand your users.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's really valuable to give access and visibility to those metrics into as many people as possible. Even the people who have what feel to you like silly questions, or maybe they don't understand what's going on with the data. When they ask, hey, why is this doing that? It forces you to sit down and take a look at that number and try to explain it. And I find, at least half the time I go, oh, wait a minute, there is something kind of strange going on here, or let's dig in a little bit further, or let's create a cohort of those users and examine why they're doing this in a way that I wouldn't have thought to otherwise, just because I see those numbers all the time and it's, it feels like second nature to me.
That's great. Next, I'd love to hear from Chris. I mean, as you mentioned, Athena Health is pretty early in its product analytics journey. Love to hear more about kind of where that started and what are some of the obstacles that you've seen and how you've overcome them.
Yeah, so Athena has, for years, had a corporate scorecard. So just a ton of metrics on all kinds of things. For instance, how many hours does a provider take to document his patients after work hours? Or what percentage of our patients are actually scheduling and also attending their wellness visits? Or how many people are actually doing self-check-ins online? So we've used data for a number of years in that way. And one of the ones that's popular, that's actually waning in popularity now, is user NPS. And we're starting to learn that maybe that's not the best way to understand our users and to drive our product design. So what we're doing now is trying to be a bit objective. A lot of the leadership discussions we have around which products get built and released uses a lot of subjective metrics. People will go out and frankly get some confirmation bias from a handful of users saying, yeah, I totally love this thing. All right. And the leadership will discuss it and push something forward. So we're trying to bring some more objectivity to that. And one way we're thinking about that is by practicing evidence-based design. And the way to think about that is you've got a triangle, and at the top you've got user perception, something like happiness metrics, and usage. So we're going to be using behavioral analytics with Amplitude. We had been a mixed panel customer for a couple of years. I got a good story about that. And the last one would be quality. So looking at not just the number of bugs or page load times, but we're doing things called design quality audits. So we're creating scores around the top workflows in Athena for how usable and well designed this is. And on average, the scores are pretty low. And we actually have about 8 to 10 user types. And among those user types, we have over 100 different critical workflows. It doesn't even include all the workflows. So Athena Health itself is an amalgamation of a ton of work that the users need to do, behind that front desk and at your doctor's desktop. So we're looking at ways to measure that quality and get the subjective scores, but also the objective usage scores as well, and kind of triangulate on that to figure out which features should we continue iterating on and either kill, or it looks good enough, or this is doing great, let's actually push this thing into the next phase.
That's great. Yeah, I love the examples of getting really granular into understanding the different user behaviors and then seeing, which features are working and not, kind of using that to drive your roadmap. I'd love to kind of continue to pull on that thread and hear examples of how analytics has actually driven product discovery, and so where you've actually come up with and influenced your product roadmap based on your use of analytics, and maybe even share an example of something that you've built through that.
Sure, I can give an example of a case where we went down a wrong path, if you like. So one of the metrics that's very important to us is 2-week retention. So 14 days, or I guess I should say during that second week, like how many people come back to use our product in that second week? So days 8 through 14, are they coming back to us? And we find that that number is, of course, lower than we'd like, so we're trying to drive that number up. Our team, this was prior to when I joined, was using Amplitude to try to figure out what correlated with that retention. What we found is that the key triggers for us were if a user saves more than 3 passwords and fills in more than 4 times. If they do that in the first 2 weeks, we had a much higher chance of getting them. And what that led to was what ultimately turned out to be a poor product decision, which was the insight that, well, all we need to do is to just get more passwords into a user's vault, and suddenly we'll be there. So what we ended up doing was spending 6 months, maybe 9 months, building out a tool to make that possible by sucking passwords out of your email and actually resetting them for you and so on, that we thought would get that number of passwords in that first 2 weeks way up, and therefore we'd be golden. And what we failed to realize, and we didn't do enough diligence, we didn't think about hard enough, was where that was fitting in the user journey. Is somebody willing to give us access to their email? Are they willing to let us take all their passwords and reset them in that first 2 weeks? And that's it's a very big commitment. It's like on the first date, you're asking, will you marry me? So that turned out to be ultimately a bad choice for us. And I think it's a case where the insight of, boy, we need to get people to use the product more in that first 2 weeks was absolutely right. But the product decision that we ultimately made based on that was very wrong for a lot of reasons that in hindsight seem relatively obvious. When we went back and looked at it, we said, okay, well, what can we do that is not trying to get our hooks into people? Can we just simply explain to people how to use the product better? Can we take some of our confusing UI, can we make it simpler? And when we started to do those basic things, ultimately built off that same bit of data insight, what we found is that we were able to drive that retention up by a third or so with just simple changes to that flow. And we've, since that point, just kept iterating on that to see how can we keep those metrics moving in the right direction with smaller changes, things that benefit users throughout their journey, not necessarily just in the first 2 weeks. And in cases where we can take very small bites that don't take 6 to 9 months of 3 or 4 engineering teams off in a corner building something, and then showing up with a ta-da moment of something that ultimately doesn't work.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of using, basically understanding that data is a signal, but not necessarily going to lead you to that, and then testing, right, to make sure that you're actually driving the right direction. In that case, there was correlation that was occurring, and so being able to actually test that and iterate against that, it's a great example.
The team took a very big leap, and big leaps scare me. I like to think I know the right answers to most questions about my product, but really sitting down and committing that many engineers and that much time to do it, it's a very scary and costly thing, and you want to make sure you can take it in little chunks in any way you can.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well, what I'd love to do next is open it up to the audience. We've had a ton of great questions today, and so I'd say who has questions for the panel?
So this is a question for Oliver. So you spoke about how you'll have these dashboards where people can see the impact on the critical event, the North Star metric. Um, how do you sort of, in general, keep the entire team, not only whatever your quote unquote growth team might be, but everybody else sort of aligned to constantly and sort of moving fast at the same time with respect to not only here's our North Star metric, here's our objectives, but now here's what we're doing to impact the objective, which is going to ultimately move that bigger number.
Yeah, it's hard, to say the least. Keeping everybody focused and everybody understanding and believing in those metrics, it's a very difficult job. I think ultimately it comes down to the product managers doing their jobs as best as possible. Every time you opt a story into a sprint or describe a feature, we try to write up one-pagers that describe the problem. And very often we like to point at those metrics as well as what we want to see those metrics do as part of that project. So if we say we want to have a feature that allows us to, a right click so that you can quickly access your vault instead of requiring you to navigate into something else. We say, okay, well, by doing so, we believe we'll allow people to access their vault faster, so they will fill in more things. That's correlated to our overall North Star metric, and therefore we think we will be more successful. And being able to think through those metrics, even in the very conception of the project, is really helpful both in clarifying why you're doing it, even to yourself when you're writing the requirements, but especially for the team. So you can sit down and say, this is what we're after. And to the point that we made earlier, I think Dan made about, what do you even track as an engineer? How do you know? Having that written right into the story, we can say, okay, these are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And then you can sit down with an engineer and say, okay, how would we go about measuring that specifically? What calls do we need to make? Where do we say the user clicked this button or it opened, or I need to know the duration that this was on screen, and so on. It becomes much easier. That said, do I believe that if I sat down with every one of my engineers and quizzed them on why are we building this particular thing and what metric is it moving, would they all pass that quiz? Absolutely not. But you hope to make strides towards that. And I think ultimately starting with the metrics and framing it that way is really the best first step.
Oliver, this is also for you. Can you talk a little bit more about the Yahoo incident, or more generally, how events that are out of your control can, how do you manage the influence on the actual product metrics that your product team really has no control over?
It's difficult. When I was at Twitter, one of my sister teams was the video team. That's built out of Boston, in case you don't know. And they are responsible for all the video playback in Twitter, even syndicated. And their key North Star metric was hours of video watched. And the problem that they found, because we would actually sit down with these metrics in our weekly PM and kind of cross-functional team meetings, we'd go through them, talk about what's moving them, go through experiments, say this experiment is moving this metric in this way, and so on. And what we found is that a particularly viral video would just blow that number out of the water. And it was particularly frustrating if you had an experiment running simultaneously. Because you're like, okay, well, now what do we do? So what we found is the best way to approach this is really to be honest with yourselves as a product team as to what you can and cannot control. So what we ended up ultimately doing, and what we do generally at LastPass when we can, is focus not on that North Star metric when it's sometimes out of your control. Focus on the metrics that are within your control that contribute to it. So for example, when a Yahoo breach happens and we see a huge spike in our registration, we see a bump of new users for a period of time, our active user number spikes up. I actually pay more attention to that 2-week retention number for those users. Are we retaining them at the same rate? Are we keeping them in our product? Are they using features in the same way? That actually becomes more important to me, and I think is a better indication of are we doing our jobs than can we ultimately drive that spike in reg. Certainly for our marketing teams, that registration is their bread and butter. That's what they spend their time doing. But for us thinking about the product that we're trying to ship, we try to stay away from those metrics that we know are going to be adversely affected by outside factors. And unfortunately, a lot of times you don't figure that out till you start trying to measure them and you go, oh, well, shit, I don't know what this means anymore. And then you pivot off of that metric and you go to something that you do understand. Or you try to devise a way that you can say, okay, let's look at these metrics, but just for users who regged more than 30 days ago or something like that, to understand slightly more granularly how you're doing.
So based on the truth, what you are going to know tomorrow is definitely more than what you're going to know today, right? So I have a question for both of you. So for a metric or for report or for decision, how do you guys manage or balance what you know tomorrow and what you know today? Especially for the example Oliver gave, like the decision was like some mistake, right? So I think that can give you some like a recommendation in the future, or give you more idea about for metric or for report for decision, what can you really manage or balance the information you have in the future.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of mitigating the risk as best you can and trying to learn as quickly as possible. The mantra fail fast, I think, is an important one. I mentioned earlier that we run an internal dog food version of our application for our employees. We track them through Amplitude as well, and it's actually quite helpful to see when we go to build those dashboards for employees of, oh shit, we forgot to track this, or this doesn't make sense anymore. And those are cases where we have set ourselves up in a process that allows us to learn iteratively along the way, so that tomorrow information comes to us as quickly as possible. But at the end of the day, I think it's a matter of being agile, being willing to learn, and being willing to essentially throw away stuff that didn't work. I'm a very, very big believer in experiments. You can't experiment your way to a product roadmap. You can't experiment your way to a vision. But once you have a direction that you're going or a hypothesis, taking those small experiments and seeing how they work is the best way to get that information in as quickly as possible and make those changes. And I think that's really the best you can do. And then if it does turn out that your experiment was wrong, sometimes it's very, very hard to throw away a baby, something that you worked on. I've had the interesting experience of killing some of my own products along the way, and it's a very hard thing to do, but sometimes it's the absolute best, and I think you have to be open to that as well.
I think it's actually a good question for Athena and a hard one to answer, because a lot of the metrics I was mentioning earlier are ones that Athena looks at quarterly. They don't necessarily look at in these shorter cycles to actually adjust the way we build product. And that itself is the issue that we're trying to move away from. Those are definitely important slow-moving metrics we need to keep track of over time to stay competitive in the industry. But I think one of our weaknesses is we're not doing enough experimentation. I alluded to this funny issue with Mixpanel earlier. So we were a Mixpanel customer for about 3 years, and there's really one team at Athena that was driving 100 million events, which was like 99% of our event volume per month to Mixpanel. And in migrating that project to Amplitude, there's about 1,200 events, and we asked the team, what are the critical metrics you're trying to measure, and what events do you need to measure those? And found out they only needed 4 events out of the 1,200. And they were relatively high volume events, but given that lesson learned, now with every team that is starting to use Amplitude at Athena, we're starting a lean UX method, and we say, look, what are the key, what's the first highest priority question or hypothesis or assumption that you're actually trying to validate or invalidate, and think really hard and thoughtfully about what are the 3 or 4 events you think you need to track to get an answer to that, and try to get that instrumented and data in Amplitude within a week if possible. Try to answer that question, do that minimum viable instrumentation, and then move on to the next question.
Yeah. We often actually start projects by instrumenting something. Because LastPass is I think it's like a 10-year-old product at this point, there's a lot of legacy code, and nobody has time to sit down and say, okay, let's instrument everything and then go back to building. So when we have a hypothesis, usually the first thing we do is say, okay, do we know anything about this area of the product, or do we know enough about this area of the product? And the answer is almost inevitably no. And then we go in and say, okay, what do we need to know? What are those key events of things that are really going to tell us if we're doing well or not? And sometimes you do put together hundreds of events for a short period of time to see how something performs. and then retire them later and keep just the 4 that matter.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to cut in here. We want to get people on their way on their afternoon if they have to take off. Before we're done, obviously want to say thanks to Chris and Oliver and Dan for speaking today. So please give them a round of applause. All right, and last thing, just to ask everyone, how many people walked away today with at least one thing that they think they can take back and improve their product with? Raise your hand. Yeah? Okay, that's good. All right, we're helping companies build better products. That's our mission. Let us know if we can help you guys with your products or your teams. If you want to learn more about our product, there's people outside. You can take a look at it. But other than that, you're free to go, so thank you.